I've always had an interest in true crime, but I'd say it peaked during my senior year of high school. Back in 2014 and 2015, I had a lot of free time on my hands and a long history with Tumblr. So I found myself in Tumblr's true crime community. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it, but for the most part, a lot of the videos I've seen don't explore its nuances. For the sake of brevity, I'll be referring to the true crime community collectively as the TCC from here on out. I've broken up the blogs who associate themselves with the TCC into 4 distinct groups of people. The first of these groups we'll call purely informative. These blogs act as more of an information repository than anything else. They provide resources, summations, links to other websites, and are probably the closest thing that you see in the community to content creators who focus on true crime here on YouTube. Something that some of these blogs would do that I found pretty great was providing resources to write to incarcerated people. It would be an understatement to say that for most people who are incarcerated, it's lonely. In some circumstances, letters are the only contact incarcerated persons have with the outside world. I think it's a wonderful thing that a blog in a small community would use the following they've gathered to help connect people with others who truly want connection. Aside from this, there's not too much more I want to touch on as far as this particular group goes. The second group I'd like to discuss is a little too comfortable but harmless. These people are pretty similar to the last group, but they take it a little bit further. Some in this group toe the line between analytical discussion and fandom-esque tangents about people who murdered other people. They're more interested in exploring the motivations behind the crimes and take a more understanding approach to some killers. Because of the more understanding approach some of these people tend to take, it can get them into a little bit of trouble. A lot of these people are minors and are exploring this interest for the first time and don't always understand where the line should be drawn when it comes to discussions of people like this. Some will get defensive when certain things they say are not the smartest, but others will simply take it as a learning experience and feel bad about what they've done. In my experience, this was the majority of people in the TCC. It was a lot of younger people, a lot of people who were still in high school, and a lot of people who were just trying to figure out where their interest in this subject matter came from. Unfortunately, most people think of the next group I'm going to discuss when they think of the TCC as a whole. We'll call the third group, Please Talk to Your Guidance Counselor. These are, for lack of a better term, the groupies of the TCC. These are the ones who glorify and make cutesy edits of serial killers and mass murderers. They may show sympathy for or outright defend these people. These people are also the ones who an outsider might initially associate most closely with the TCC as a whole. But in my experience with the community, these people were a minority who were, in most cases, very quickly shut down by other members of the community who could see through what they were doing. There are a lot of complicated reasons as to why someone might engage in this behavior. Some are self-professed hybristophiliacs, or people who are sexually attracted to those who have committed serious crimes. Some are disenfranchised teenagers who, whether through genuine interest or a desire to be edgy, have found themselves sympathizing with school shooters and serial killers. Whether it's a platonic or a romantic infatuation, these people feel deeply connected to the people they discuss. But the distinction between this group and the last group that I will discuss is that these people have no intention of trying to emulate their idols. The fourth and final group is Someone Please Call the Cops. This is the most dangerous section of the TCC. These people openly discuss their desire to emulate the killers they idolize in every possible way. As an example of the things people would discuss openly, I wasn't able to find anything on this particular person in my research, but I remember distinctly when I was a part of the community, there was someone who would post about different poisons that he would make. He would talk about buying different compounds and chemicals, mixing them, his research into creating more potent ones, and all of this he did to his followers, not in private, not in secret, just open. So if someone was willing to discuss something as serious as poisoning other people publicly, what were the things people were discussing privately? In February of 2015, 2 old friends and 1 new friend were set to meet for the very first time. Fortunately for their intended targets, this wouldn't happen. There was fairly sparse news coverage on this case, although footage exists online of the arraignment of the individuals I will be discussing. However, I haven't seen anyone discuss it the way that I'm going to be talking about it, which is why I felt compelled to make this video. I'd like to introduce you to the 3 people I will be discussing from this point on. James Gamble, also known as Shallow Existences on Tumblr, 19 years old, from Halifax, Nova Scotia. Randall, or Randy Shepherd, also known as Genesis to Genocide on Tumblr, 20 years old, also from Halifax, Nova Scotia. LINDSAY SOUVANNARATH, also known as Cock Swastika on Tumblr, 22 years old, from Illinois. James had one of the more popular blogs in the TCC around this time, and there was a reason for that. It was rare to see guys in the TCC, and so when one showed up, it was almost guaranteed that he would become a popular figure in the community. If I could extrapolate for a minute, I think part of the reason why figures like James were so popular among teenage girls in the TCC is because they acted like proxies for the killers these girls were studying. I think that since James was around the same age, looked like them, talked like them, felt like them, these girls could feel as though they were getting a real experience with the people they'd become infatuated with. It's the closest girls who are attracted to those kinds of people can get to dating a Columbine shooter, for example. With the kind of positive reinforcement James was receiving from his followers for the content on his blog, it was only a matter of time before people began to speak up against him. A group of individuals, largely women in their late teens and early 20s, were beginning to voice their concerns over the kinds of content James was posting on his blog. James had always posted more edgy or risque things, but now the content was veering into a steady streamline of Nazi imagery, self-harm, and his own nudes. The nude images and gifs of himself were the things that these women took the most issue with, primarily because of James's largely underage follower base. This group of people, which we will refer to as Anti-J, will come back later in this video, but for now, all you need to know is that they were getting into a series of arguments back and forth with James over the content he was posting on his blog. James did not take very kindly to these people and made it clear that he felt they were harassing him. Randy and James appear to have been friends for quite some time. They grew up in the same area, they went to high school together, and were even co-workers for a time at a local Walmart. Randy's blog appears to have been made a few years before James's, but the focus on true crime was not as strong initially. Even once he had become a part of the TCC, the focus of his blog seemed to be more on horror movies, metal, and the occasional gore. There was a decent amount of interaction between James and Randy's blogs, as well as their audiences, although Randy never managed to accrue as large a following as James did during his time in the TCC. Unlike James, Randy managed to avoid courting any controversy with other users because the content he posted to his blog was far more typical for the community. Out of all 3 people involved in this plot, Randy seems to be the one who is able to fly under the radar most effectively. Lindsay would create a DeviantArt account sometime in high school under the name Snoopy Femme. While browsing DeviantArt, she would come across imagery of Nazi and neo-Nazi artwork and would become fascinated by this. Her interest in Nazis would only increase as time went on and would eventually come to shape the way in which she viewed other people and the world around her. In her 20s, she would make a Tumblr account and find herself a part of Tumblr's true crime community. Eventually, she met someone named James, and they hit it off instantly. James and Lindsay had a lot in common, and it wasn't long before things turned from friendship to romance. But there wasn't just romance. There was a common goal that these 2 people shared. Their disgust with humanity and with the world around them would manifest in an idea. This idea would become a plan, that would be formulated over the course of several months. James and Lindsay had a specific interest in the Columbine shooters and saw themselves as sort of reincarnated versions of the two. They felt they could learn from the mistakes and miscalculations made by the Columbine shooters in order to do what they did, but bigger and better. On February 12, 2015, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, received a tip through Crime Stoppers that 3 persons were planning to commit a mass killing at the Halifax shopping centre. In the early morning of February 13th, police staked out James Gamble's duplex home in Timberley, a small suburb outside of Halifax. After both of Gamble's parents had left the house and been questioned by police entered the house and found James Gamble deceased from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. When news of James's suicide broke on Tumblr, it was from the people who knew him personally. There were no news reports available yet, so people were understandably confused as to why James had done this. James was a prominent figure in the community, and to have this happen without any explanation or even a hint of one was extremely shocking. For those who had become fans of him, there was a lot of anger and resentment, and unfortunately, that became directed at the group of anti-J people I mentioned earlier in this video. Because there was very little information available at the time, people began to assume that the reason James had committed suicide was because of the perceived harassment he'd been receiving from the anti-J group. Those who were a part of this group were immediately forced to go on the defensive, but this would fall on deaf ears until more information would come out. It would soon come to light that James had committed suicide because the police were outside his home asking him to surrender. What the TCC was about to realize was that there was a murder plot that had been developing right before their eyes for the past several months. They were watching it develop in real time, but whether it's because they didn't see the signs or because no one thought anyone would actually do something like this is only up to speculation. At the same time, the police arrested Lindsay SOUVANNARATH and Randall Shepard at Halifax Stanfield International Airport. Shepard was meeting SOUVANNARATH, Gamble's online girlfriend, as she arrived from the United States. The police learned that it was the trio's intention to go into a public venue and open fire, attempting to kill as many people as possible before turning the guns on themselves, on February 14th, Valentine's Day. It's hard to imagine how no one caught on when James and Lindsay were being relatively brazen about the event they were planning online. They even went so far as to create a fake movie poster of themselves commemorating the massacre they were planning. Other examples of hints James and Lindsay were leaving exist in reblogged images and text posts from around the same time. This kind of hinting isn't uncommon, as it can be seen in the case of Randy's stair, where an individual went to the Weis supermarket where he worked and shot 3 of his co-workers and himself. Randy, otherwise known online as Andrew Blaze, had created a network of accounts to support a franchise he was attempting to create called Ember's Ghost Squad, or EGS. In the months and weeks leading up to this massacre, Randy would post frequently on these accounts hinting at what was to come. Unfortunately, in this case as well, no one was able to see the signs soon enough. During my time in the community, I became pretty close friends with someone who we will call David. David had been friends with James prior to me meeting him, and told me a little bit about the things they would discuss together. It seemed as though James and David had been planning something similar to what James and Lindsay would ultimately go on to plan together. For whatever reason, it fell through, and so did their friendship. Something I also learned in my conversations with David was that he and James had nicknames for one another. They would call each other Reb and Vodka. As most of you may know, these are the same nicknames that were used by the Columbine shooters for one another. Additionally, there is a link that remains on Lindsay's blog that says Vodka, which links directly to James's page. Around the same time that James and David stopped being friends with one another, James had another falling out with a girl that we will call Amy. Amy and James had followed each other for some time and would reblog pictures of each other, commenting flirtatious things. Pretty soon, people began to suspect there was something more going on between them than friendship. And then everything just kind of stopped. It seemed as though something had happened between James and Amy that had caused them to break up or lose touch or something. I can't be sure of this, but I have a suspicion that the falling out between James and David and James and Amy had something to do with the growing friendship between Lindsay and James. I also suspect, as did others at the time, that Amy might have been the one to place the Crime Stoppers tip mentioned in the reports. On November 22, 2016, Randy Shepard pled guilty at Nova Scotia Supreme Court on the charge of conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, less 974 days for time served. Lindsay SOUVANNARATH was expected to go on trial in May 2017 on the charges of conspiracy to commit murder and conspiracy to commit arson, but instead pleaded guilty in April. On April 20, 2018, she was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 10 years. SOUVANNARATH appealed her sentence, arguing it was flawed and manifestly harsh and excessive. However, the appeal was denied on May 29, 2019. Once the story had begun to come out and the dust was beginning to settle, the energy in the community shifted. Because of the inextricable role the TCC played in bringing these three individuals together, the remaining members were understandably nervous about any increased scrutiny that would be brought to the community. A lot of people had been discussing the possibility of federal agencies looking into the TCC and its associated tags. Many people either began to wipe content from their blogs that could possibly get them questioned or deleted their presences altogether. I think for a lot of people, as well as myself, this moment was a turning point in the community. When you're a part of something like the TCC, it's very easy to become desensitized to extraordinarily graphic imagery because it's something you see every day. You talk constantly about details of cases that involve horrific things happening to people. You don't always grasp the full severity of a situation when it's something that is so common to you. I think the personal nature of this particular case to the people who were a part of the community, because it was done by people who were like us, it hit a little differently. It kind of stripped away any sort of pretensions that people who were a part of the community couldn't do something like the people we were talking about. It made the things that we were learning about reality. For anyone who may be watching this that was in some way affected by the things I discussed today, my heart goes out to you. This is a horrific crime, and I can't imagine the impact it must have had on someone who experienced it firsthand. I wanted this video to be primarily structured around my own experiences in the TCC, so I will be leaving additional resources for you to learn more about this case in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will hopefully be seeing you again soon in another video.